Maya Patel tightened the straps of her ice axe to her pack as the first streaks of dawn teased the horizon with a pale, rose-tinted light. At 3,800 meters, the trail she followed wound through a stately forest of dwarf rhododendrons, their gnarled trunks dusted with yesterday's frost. Every breath Maya drew filled her lungs with the bracing tang of pine and the faint metallic scent of impending winter. She paused to sip from her insulated flask, savoring the warmth of tea against the chill that settled like a slow ache into her bones. Her plan had been meticulous, a solo trek along a centuries-old shepherd's route, tracing forgotten passes between flinty peaks and terraced fields. Maya's guidebook had warned that these trails were seldom trodden beyond mid-spring snowmelt. Yet the September forecast promised clear skies, and she had pushed higher, drawn by the promise of solitude and the quiet grandeur of the Annapurna Range. By mid-morning, the forest began to thin. Stunted pines gave way to open slopes streaked with leftover snow, and the air grew thinner, each inhalation demanding greater effort. Maya paused again, glancing at her altimeter, 4,200 meters. Her legs burned under the weight of her pack, but excitement propelled her onward. Ahead, the path dipped into a narrow ravine, her next landmark before the final ascent to the Shepherd's Pass. Dark clouds, however, had silently gathered behind the peaks, cloaking the sky in slate-gray folds. A harsh wind swept through the ravine, knocking Maya's hood back and whipping snowflakes into her cheeks. She pulled the hood tight, her breath forming tiny ice crystals on her eyelashes. The wind's song turned frantic, a low, moaning howl that rattled the remaining leaves on branches and stirred ripples across snow-covered boulders. Maya hesitated, tension rising. She checked her compass, noting a slight wobble in the needle as burly gusts rattled the magnetized case. It was a warning sign she could not ignore. She scanned the slopes above, corniced ridges loomed, their overhangs sagging ominously under the weight of wet snow. A deep rumble, faint but unmistakable, vibrated through the ground. Snow shifted on a distant ridge in a slow, rolling slide. Her heart lurched. Conditions had deteriorated faster than her forecast predicted. Determined to find shelter, Maya turned back into the ravine, but the wind intensified, cutting across the defile like a freight train. Snow fell in fat, wet flakes that plastered her clothing and swallowed the trail behind her in ghostly white. She retrieved her GPS, but the screen froze in the howling wind. Panic fluttered in her chest as she realized she was no longer certain of her bearings. Every cairn she had marked yesterday had vanished beneath fresh drifts. The path had become an endless expanse of shifting white, and the world contracted to the beam of her headlamp and the pounding of her heart. A sudden crack like thunder echoed from above. Maya looked up to see a cornice and overhanging lip of snow shear off in a jagged wave, sending a cascade of ice and powder down the mountainside. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled backward as the avalanche's roar filled the ravine. When the tremors subsided, an unnatural silence pressed in. Maya's compass spun wildly. She was lost. Trembling, she fumbled for her whistle and blew 3 short blasts. The wind swallowed each echo. She called out, voice hoarse, "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" Her words drifted away on swirling currents of snow. Alone, she wrapped her arms around her pack, praying for a sign, any sign, that she had not wandered into a void from which there was no return. Then, through the whiteout, she saw movement, a pair of russet shapes far above on a rocky ledge, sharply outlined against the swirling snow. A stag, antlers regal even in the storm, stood motionless, watching her with calm, unblinking eyes. Its breath steamed in the cold air, and snowflakes accumulated on its powerful shoulders. For a fleeting moment, Maya felt the world still. The storm's fury subsided, and a single thought crystallized in her mind: this wild creature was meant to be here, as if the mountains themselves had sent a guide to lead her from this white peril. Gathering her courage, Maya rose to her feet, tightening her gaiters against the drift. She exhaled in a steady hiss of determination. If the stag could stand firm in the storm, so could she. She lifted her hand in a silent plea for help and took her first tentative step toward the stag's watchful silhouette, ready to follow wherever it might lead in the hopes of finding both safety and sanctuary. The storm intensified as midday blurred into an unforgiving swirl of snow and wind. Maya's vision narrowed to a few frantic meters ahead, her breath turning to ice on her goggles as she pressed on. The once distinct shepherd's trail had vanished beneath fresh drifts, leaving behind only a featureless expanse of white. Every footstep threatened to disappear the moment it formed, and the cold bit through her layers until her fingers felt as though they might fracture on her ice axe shaft. Panic fluttered in her chest, but Maya sucked in a steadying breath, reminding herself of her training: stay calm, conserve energy, and search for shelter or a landmark. She raised her head, peering through the veil of falling snow, and there, just ahead, stood the stag's broad silhouette atop a wind-scoured knoll. Its dark, antlered head was outlined against the churning sky, nostrils flaring as it exhaled plumes of steam into the storm. Heart-pounding, Maya called out, "Here, I'm this way." A weak gust stole her voice, but the stag did not flee. Instead, it dipped its head once and turned slowly, then began to descend toward her, each sure-hoofed step cutting a shallow trench through the drifts. Maya felt a spark of hope ignite. If she could follow the stag, perhaps it knew a safer path through this white hell. Gathering her courage, Maya closed the distance, tracking the stag's hoofprints as they led away from the ravine's blind end. The wind lashed across her back, but she pressed on, her gloved hands gripping her pack straps for balance. The stag led her around a hidden outcrop of rocks where the wind funneled fiercely, guiding her instead through a narrow gap where the swirling snow was broken by the lee of a pine grove. Beneath the tree boughs, the drifted snow lay lighter and the gusts less violent, offering Maya a moment's respite. She crouched briefly to clear her goggles and sip from her flask, marveling that the stag paused only long enough for her to catch up before turning once more. Its deep, liquid eyes met hers in silent assurance, and Maya felt a profound connection, a recognition that they were allies against the fury of the mountains. Behind her, the world remained a mass of white, but ahead, the stag's path wound steadily upward, away from the ravine's danger and toward higher, more sheltered ground. As they climbed, wind-hardened pines gave way to stunted junipers whose knotted trunks formed a natural barricade against drifting snow. The stag led her beneath their protective canopy, where the snowfall thinned to a fine veil and the air grew quieter. Maya exhaled, feeling her racing pulse slow as the stag guided her into the shelter of this hidden glade. Here, at last, she felt the storm's grip lessen, and the stag paused on a rocky ledge, its head turned back in invitation. Summoning her remaining strength, Maya stepped forward, grateful and awed that in her darkest hour, a wild spirit of the mountain had become her steadfast guide. Below them yawned the Kamrong ravine, a jagged gash in the mountainside carved by meltwater and hidden beneath a deceptive blanket of fresh snow. Maya's heart hammered as she peered over the lip. A cascade of icy water hissed far below, and the only visible crossing was a half-submerged suspension bridge, its iron cables swaying dangerously in the gusting wind. She swallowed hard, every instinct screaming to turn back, but the stag stood unwavering on a narrow shelf of rock beside her, its keen eyes fixed ahead. With a soft nudge as if to encourage her onward, the stag hopped onto a large, flat boulder protruding from the edge of the ravine. It tested the stone with a hoof, found it steady, and then leapt gracefully to a second boulder partially submerged in the rushing water. Maya watched its every confident movement, drawing courage from its sure-footedness. She planted her ice axe for balance, flexed her stiff knees, and took her first trembling step onto the same rock. The cold water sprayed over her boots as she forced a steady breath and shifted her weight, careful, deliberate, resisting the pull of panic. Behind her, the wind hissed, but the stag remained her silent beacon. Maya hopped to the next stone, gloved hands gripping the ice axe for purchase, the surface slick beneath her crampons. Each time her foot slipped, the stag paused and looked back, as though to say, "Trust me." Moving as if in a trance, she followed its lead, rock to rock, balancing on narrow edges, ignoring the roaring chasm below. Halfway across, a sudden tremor rattled the bridge above them. Snow and ice echoed from the cables, and Maya's heart lurched. She froze, one misstep now could be fatal. The stag remained poised, its muscles relaxed but ready. Summoning every ounce of concentration, Maya forced her mind clear of fear. She bent her knees, centered her weight over her crampons, and breathed in rhythm with the stag's measured stance. Then she stepped forward onto the final boulder, her boots finding solid grip, and scrambled onto the far bank. The stag exhaled softly, flanked her as she steadied herself on the snow-packed ground, and bowed its head in a gesture of triumph. Maya sank to her knees, pressing her palm to the hard, icy earth in gratitude. Behind her, the bridge's cables groaned as another chunk of ice slid free, but here, safety lay beneath the pines. As the stag turned toward the next stretch of trail, Maya rose and followed, her terror tempered into awe for the silent guide who had carried her across the icebound ravine when all hope seemed lost. The moment Maya set foot on solid ground beyond the ravine, she felt the storm's fury begin to wane. The wind, though still insistent, had softened into a steady hiss, and the world around her shimmered in a fragile half-light. The stag paused on a flat ledge, nostrils flaring as it tasted the turning air, then turned and led Maya into a narrowing defile where ancient pines, gnarled and frost-laced, stood sentinel on either side. Their bent trunks formed a leaning corridor, needles dusted in hoarfrost, each branch creaking as though groaning beneath winter's weight. Beneath the pines, the trail was treacherous. Fresh drifts concealed iced-over roots, and patches of black ice lurked beneath the snow's powdery veneer. Maya advanced tentatively, each step probing for solid footing. When her boot sliced through a drift and she nearly pitched forward, the stag's warm flank pressed gently against her elbow, steadying her wobble. She exhaled in relief, the stag's breath steaming in the cold air like a whisper of reassurance. They reached a narrow choke point where the forest floor had given way to a collapsed rockfall. Massive boulders, some as large as a hut, blocked the path, their weathered faces slick with icy runoff. Between the stones lay a yawning gap, too wide to leap and too deep to descend. Maya's heart sank. She scanned the rubble for another route, but towering trunks pressed in from behind. With a soft snort, the stag stepped forward and nudged Maya's hand with its muzzle, its antlers brushing the low boughs as it slipped between two sentinel pines. Perplexed but trusting, Maya followed. The stag threaded a narrow animal trail that veered around the rockslide's edge, disappearing into a tangle of juniper and rhododendron. Snow-heavy branches brushed her cheeks as she ducked beneath them, heart pounding in her throat. For a moment, she lost sight of the stag, then caught its dark form perched high on a fallen fir trunk bridging the top of the slide. It tapped the trunk with a precise hoofprint and turned, as if urging her onward. Maya exhaled, steeling herself. She hoisted her pack higher, tested the trunk's width with her ice axe, and placed a tentative boot on the rough bark. The surface was slick, but the stag's confident stance gave her courage. Hand over hand, she edged across the log's length, each step measured, crampon teeth biting into the grooved wood. Beneath her, she heard the tinny crunch of small stones dislodged by her weight, and the distant gurgle of meltwater trickling through hidden channels. Halfway across, the log trembled under the wind's assault. Maya froze, sight blurred by swirling spindrift, but the stag remained motionless, a steadfast beacon in the whiteout. She forced her muscles to relax, drew a deep breath, and completed the traverse. On the far side, the stag waited, its gentle eyes reflecting dawn's first pale light. Maya sank to her knees, touching the smooth bark with gratitude before rising to follow. Together they climbed a short, steep incline where young pines gave way to scrub juniper and wind-scoured lichen. The stag paused at each step, sniffing the air and flicking its ears to catch the faint murmur of civilization below. And then, through a break in the trees, Maya saw warm lights glimmering against the mountainside, the Osborne Lodge, its windows aglow and welcome. Relief washed over her so fiercely that her knees went weak. She turned to the stag, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, though the only answer was the soft scrape of snow under its hoof. With one last look, antlers silhouetted against a rosy sky, the stag slipped into the tree line, vanishing as silently as it had appeared, leaving Maya to stumble toward warmth, guided by the bond they had forged in the storm's heart. The glow of lantern light spilled out from the wooden veranda of the Osborne Lodge, painting the falling snow in warm amber hues. Maya Patel's legs trembled as she stumbled through the knee-deep drifts, each step driven by the promise of heat and safety. Behind her, the storm had finally relented, leaving the world hushed and crystalline under a blanket of fresh snow. The wind no longer screamed, it merely whispered through the pines, as though escorting her toward refuge. As Maya crossed the final threshold, she was met by a flurry of voices and outstretched arms. Sherpas and lodge staff rushed forward, wrapping her in thick woolen blankets and pressing steaming mugs of spiced ginger tea into her numb hands. The fragrance of cinnamon and clove felt like a miracle after the biting cold. Maya sank onto a cushioned bench beside a roaring hearth, the heat washing through her frozen layers, searing away the last echoes of fear. A local guide, Tashi, knelt at her side to inspect her boots, gently chipping away the encasing ice, while a nurse pressed a thermometer to her brow and murmured reassurances. Maya's gaze drifted to the window, where snowflakes danced in the lantern glow, and there, on a knoll just beyond the lodge's stone wall, stood Arun, the russet stag whose silent guidance had carried her through the storm. His antlers caught the firelight, casting long, graceful shadows on the snow. For a moment, Stag and human locked eyes. Maya offered a trembling nod of gratitude, and Arun dipped his head once before turning and melting into the silent woods. Inside, the lodge's common room bustled with relieved chatter. A group of trekkers who had gathered before the storm broke into cheers when Maya entered, their concern giving way to joy at her safe return. Plates of steaming dalbot and freshly baked flatbread were passed around, and Maya found herself tearing into warm food she could barely taste, her mouth too parched from cold and adrenaline. Yet each bite restored a flicker of life to her bones. As dusk deepened into a star-washed night, the storm-tossed world outside settled into peaceful stillness. Maya sat by the hearth, wrapped in blankets, as the lodge owner, Mr. Tapa, recounted how search teams, alerted by Tashi's radio call, had combed the ravine and snowfields until they found her abandoned ice axe marking the point where she'd lost the trail. But truly, he said, leaning in with a conspiratorial smile, we all know it was Arun who carried you home. Maya closed her eyes and pictured the stag's steady silhouette against the snow, each measured step a promise of safety. She traced her finger around the rim of her teacup, reflecting on the hours of terror, the whiteout's blind terror, the roaring avalanche that drove her from the path, the treacherous stones of the ravine, the slick log bridge, and finally this narrow pine-scrawled pass. Time and again, it had felt as if all hope was lost until Arun appeared, unbidden, as a mountain spirit come to her aid. Later that night, as the other guests drifted into slumber, Maya stepped outside onto the veranda. The stars glittered above a silent world, and the temperature had dropped again, frosting her eyelashes. She peered toward the dark treeline. There, barely visible in the silver light, Arun stood watch on the knoll. Maya bowed her head in a soft gesture of thanks. He dipped his antlers, then disappeared into the shadowed forest. Maya felt at peace. The storm's crucible had tested her resolve, but in the end, she had not walked the white peril alone. Guided by the stag's unfaltering sure-footedness, she had crossed ravines, navigated hidden hazards, and found sanctuary in the lodge's glowing warmth. In that hushed moment of starlight and snow, she vowed to carry Arun's gift forward, not just as a story of survival, but as a reminder that even in the vast solitude of the mountains, unexpected kindness can appear in the form of a gentle guide, leading us, step by step, back to safety.